I've been involved with the European Code of Conduct, so obviously I've been thinking a lot about codes of conduct over the last year or two. I've ate them, I've slept them, I'm obsessed by them. But you know, in thinking about, and are we right here? Yes. So, in thinking about codes of conduct, I've also been thinking about the evolution of thinking around research integrity that has gone on, and it's been really quite extraordinary. If you think about what's happened between the first Congress in Lisbon and today's Congress, I mean, there's been a whole shift in thinking about, you know, can we even agree we've got a problem, to how do we define it, to, you know, what kind of evidence do we need, what kind of structures, what processes, how can we promote, and here we are today talking about transparency and accountability and governance. And really, in my mind, what we're talking about here is a sort of a shift in thinking away from individual responsibility to a more collective approach to research integrity, which is great. And it does kind of sit well with the idea of codes of conduct and harmonization. So let's have a little definition of harmonization. I've got a few of these because it's interesting if you look at these definitions, they come from different perspectives. So this one is from Wikipedia. You know, it's a very well-known, very sort of credible source, but anyway, it's the one that many people go to. And harmonization here is defined as the process of minimizing redundancy or conflicting standards which have evolved independently. Okay, so if that's what we want to do, what are the drivers for that? Well, of course, I mean, there are huge drivers for this. Naturally enough, we're all sort of pointing in the same direction here. There's been a really steady rise in scientific productivity and investment over the last 20 years. You know, we've got a huge rise in the number of journal papers that are being published, and there's lots of problems, as we hear about, that are associated with them. A huge rise in multi-author papers, which means a huge rise in collaboration, and again, that generates its own problems. There's been not a huge rise, but there has been a steady rise in commercialization outputs from research over the last number of years, and countries are spending more in R&D. So, I mean, essentially, at the moment in Europe, we are spending 2.3% of GDP on R&D. That's a huge chunk of the budget if you think about the total budget. A 25.5% increase in the number of graduates in STEM since 2008. The thing is, governments and the public, they want to be sure that this money is being spent properly and it's being spent well. And we have to rely on the public and, by implication, government then, to support us in these efforts. So, you know, when you have misconduct scandals, when you've got growing evidence of poor practices, that doesn't help our case as researchers. So, there's been a lot of effort to try and harmonise, to try and bring a bit of order into, and to be seen to be bringing order to this landscape as well. You know, you've got the European Commission, who have become very involved in this area in the last couple of years. The OECD have produced some fantastic sort of baseline documents that many of us have used. UNESCO and ComStat have become involved, and so on and so forth. There are many, many kind of international governmental organisations. Also, the NGOs at an international level have really been working hard in this area. As I say, the latest one was the ALIA Code of Conduct, which was published in when was it? End of March, but Science Europe have been working in this area. The Inter-Academy Partnership have published something, the Global Research Council, NRIO is working on networks, COPE have produced some fantastic guidelines, LERU have, EUA have. So what I'm saying is lots and lots of people are working in this area. So has that had any impact at all? Well, I think it has. I mean, research integrity, if you think about it, it's being discussed now in a way that was absolutely unimaginable 20 years ago when I kind of started to get involved in this. There are 800 delegates at this conference versus 150, I think you said, in Lisbon, Nick. You know, so there really has been an impact in terms of awareness. The Council of Ministers in the EU, one of their conclusions that the Luxembourg presidency was on research integrity. That was the first. It is seen as a legitimate subject for research. That didn't used to be the case. There have been changes in European Commission policy and in contractual clauses, which have been evolving since Framework 6. As I say, the revised Code of Conduct was based on broad consultation, including enterprise. That was the first time that had been done. There really is a greater understanding about the importance of climate and environment. And there are more and more organizations organizing training of some stripe. Now, I've heard, I mean, it varies hugely. I mean, that's for sure, it does vary hugely. And since 2013, the number of European countries who have developed or are in the process of developing national codes of conduct, guidelines, policies, frameworks, call them what you will, has really risen. Okay, so here's another definition of harmonisation, one that I like a little bit better in some ways because it's probably closer to what a lot of people think of harmonisation. It's the act of making systems or laws the same or similar in different countries so that they can work together more easily. And I mean, really, that's what we're trying to achieve at the end of the day here. So how's that going for us? Well, middling, I'd say, is there. I mean, Simon Guschel published a very well-known paper back in 2013 called Research Integrity, No Harmony in Europe. And what he looked at were what was happening at a national level in countries. So some countries had no policies at all. Some countries were in the middle of developing policies. Some countries had policies that had no legislative basis. Some countries had policies that did have legislative basis. And there were all sorts of variations in the middle. Now, thankfully, the number of countries that have no policies at all has fallen significantly. So, I mean, we published our own policy in 2015. Luxembourg has published. Spain has published. Austria has published. France has just published a policy and is about to put together a national ORI office, and Italy has published some national guidelines as well. But even with all of that, there's still a lot of heterogeneity. People are coming at this from very, very, very different angles. So, poor Simon, when he looked at his data, he threw his hands in the air in despair and said, the current confusing situation concerning research integrity guidance at a national level hampers international research and possibly wastes research funds, and that's a pretty serious thing. But the thing, I was thinking about that, you know, and I mean, the difficulty for us is that this heterogeneity in national policies is really a reflection of heterogeneity in Europe, in the European landscape. For example, we speak different languages, and that causes problems when it comes to having a word in some instances for integrity, and all the arguments about, well, what do you call it if you don't call it integrity, and how can we kind of build that into our own policies. We've got different national legislation as well. This is one on crowdfunding, which I thought was quite interesting, and where different countries in Europe sit on the idea of crowdfunding. We've got different perceptions of corruption and corruption levels. I'm not saying we have different corruption, but perceptions of corruption are different across Europe. We have different levels of investment in R&D, even though everybody's kind of supposedly working through a 3% GDP target in the European Union. Many of us are well away from that still. We have different approaches to increasing nationalisation of research. And of course, when you talk about internationalisation, you're immediately talking about collaboration and trying to work across borders. And we have different levels of student participation, for example, in research. So, where does that leave us? Well, I mean, it's all very complicated, isn't it? And it's even more complicated when you think that when we talk about research integrity, we're actually talking about a multifactorial environment. And it's a resource-limited environment, which puts a lot of stress on the system. So if you think about it, we have a real difficulty in terms of culture and governance in many places with absence of robust policies and structures. Many governments do not prioritise still research integrity. Organisations are often sort of very slow to resource research integrity. On the funding side of it, I mean, we've still got the winner-takes-all approach, no matter what the funding agencies say, and I'm a member of a funding agency. It's just, in some ways, it's the lazy way of assessing what you're trying to fund. There is this huge emphasis on high-impact publications and funding track record. In terms of promotion and prevention, I mean, graduate education is not universal in Europe yet. It's a long way from universal. The quality of the teaching curricula is very patchy, and responsibility of mentors is emphasised, not emphasised. Sometimes they're supported, sometimes they're not supported. So a lot of heterogeneity there. In terms of dissemination, it's a real difficulty for researchers because really a lot of the journals are still looking for innovative, important, new research. So if you want to do replication studies, if you have an important negative result, it can sometimes be very hard to publish it. And, you know, it's fantastic that we've got open journals and open access, but there is still a long way for us to go for that to be truly universal. In terms of career systems, universities still aren't looking at people's broader achievements. So they're looking at the career track record, they're looking at the high impact journals, and it's very hard if you're involved in other things or if you've have really good behaviors that should be incentivized by universities. To be honest, in terms of promotion, they don't count. So, you know, there's not much incentive there. So what I've been thinking about is, with all of that heterogeneity, with that complex environment, how can we, or can we even, harmonize understanding, good practice, processes, and so on? So just step back for a minute here and think about, what are we actually trying to do when we talk about harmonization? Why are we developing codes, policies, guidelines, and so on? And I think that we're developing them for lots of different reasons, and it depends on the level. So at an international and global level, when developing a code of conduct, what you're really trying to do here is to provide some sort of framework or scaffold, as I was describing to someone yesterday, essentially setting out some of the ground rules from which national and local legislation and regulation and codes and guidelines and so on can develop. You're trying to sort of create some kind of common understanding of the terminology and the ambitions and have some sort of consistency. So this is really all you're trying to do with an international code of conduct. At the national level, things get a little bit more serious, because now you're actually probably trying to set out expectations for behavior from your researchers at a national and local level. But also you may be trying to use your national codes to facilitate training and cross university or cross-sectoral collaboration within your country. And then, of course, there are the theme, field, discipline-specific codes and guidelines. And what they're trying to do then is focus, of course, on the specific elements that will be individual to a particular discipline, to a particular field. So, taking all that into account and looking at the top level here, and I'm an evaluator by trade, so I like to talk about primary outcomes and outputs. Are there any primary outcomes, as in short-term sort of outcomes, from developing international codes at a national level? Well, definitely on the culture side. If you're providing a framework, it really does help people at a national level to sort of develop their own codes of conduct, at least following the same ground rules, if nothing else. It does provide a kind of common terminology. It can sort of point out new areas that people need to focus on in their national codes, and it can raise awareness at a national level as well. From the funder's perspective, it doesn't really do that much to have an international code of conduct. You know, it doesn't really change their behavior. It does and can help on the promotion and prevention side. It may raise awareness nationally and at institutions. It can facilitate political leverage, which is very important. So you can turn to your political masters locally and say, listen, guys, there's this new international code. We really need to get our house in order and line up with this. So it can provide really, and you know, we've certainly used that in Ireland, and it can also encourage diverse stakeholders sort of engagement in developing a national code based on an international code. It doesn't really do much for dissemination. You know, an international code doesn't really change how people are behaving on a local level, and it doesn't really do much for the career system. So, if that's the case then, what does it do? Well, I'd like to talk to you just very quickly about the cascade effect, because I've been thinking about, well, you know, to be honest, at one point I was thinking, why are we bothering? Why are we even bothering with international codes if they're not having kind of really major impacts on local codes? But actually, from my own experience, and I'll use Ireland as an example, there is a really significant cascade effect that happens. So, what happens? Okay, 2010, the ESF ALIA Code of Conduct was published in Europe, and that gave us a little bit of political leverage in Ireland to try and get together some people. It was a small number of people in the beginning. We were able to pull in the Royal Irish Academy, some of the funding agencies, some interested universities, and so on. And we had our first ever seminar on research integrity. And from that, we published Fostering Research Integrity, and in that, we sort of set out what Ireland might be able to do themselves. Arising from that was our national policy. You can see it took 5 years to do it, but, we did it 5 years, and it was a really good policy. And one of the major recommendations in that policy was that we set up a national forum, which would have the funding agencies, it would have the quality associations, the training bodies, the universities, the institutes of technologies, so everybody around the table working on trying to improve things in Ireland. And we've made some really significant progress in the space of 2 years. For a start, the universities have started really seriously strengthening their policies and their processes and working through all of the difficulties of implementation. The funding agencies have got together to talk about how can they strengthen both their terms and conditions in terms of their aspirations of what they would like the universities to do with their funding in terms of research integrity, but also starting the conversation about, can we do things better? Can we stop looking at the high impact journals or the number of publications and try to think a little bit more imaginatively about how we assess funding? It has sparked off development of core curricula nationally, and also a number of the universities have joined UK Rio to help them where they have some difficulties. And for the first time ever, research integrity was included as an action in our national R&D strategy up to 2020. So that was a real coup. So in 2017, along comes the National Code of Conduct. What are we going to do? Well, the first thing we're going to do is make sure that our code still lines up. And if it doesn't, we'll review it. And that will pull in more stakeholders again, and the circle will go round and round and round. So there's a really significant cascade effect here. So my argument would be that international codes, while they might not have major primary outcomes, they have really significant secondary impacts. So if you look at the culture, it will encourage you to develop and disseminate your national and local policies and structures, and at least you're using the same framework that your colleagues across Europe are using. It provides you with, I was going to say a stick to beat the universities, but that is not the way I was trying to describe it. It provides you with leverage to try and encourage the universities to put more resources in, and also encourage organisational responsibility, which is really important. In terms of funding and assessment, as I say, it does sort of push the funding agencies to think about more diverse funding models and think about more sort of ambitious and creative ways of actually deciding how they're going to give out the research funding. So rather than having it based on quantity, how's about we look at quality and some of the things there. And so that would really encourage us to develop broader assessment criteria and new peer review models. I mean, we quite like the post-peer review model, for example, in the publications that we fund. In terms of promotion, it really helps with the development of training programs and CDP. It sort of brings into focus the trainer initiatives and the difficulties sometimes with trainers not being trained. And we're doing quite a lot of that in Ireland at the moment. And it really does push people towards kind of evidence-based and career stage appropriate curricula. In terms of dissemination, what does it do? Well, there's actually a lot of opportunity now to publish negative results, far more than there were back in 2010. For example, there are some really interesting open publishing platforms now. There are journals that will specifically publish negative results. So, I think the national policies and the local policies can really encourage people to publish both their negative and their positive results, and not to sit on them as well. And, many of the funding agencies in Ireland and across Europe have mandated open access and are moving now towards mandating data access. And, we've done things like we've insisted on trial registration. I heard a lot mentioned about that. And basically trying to think about supporting replication studies. So there's a huge amount there. And then in terms of career, it pushes the universities to start thinking about how can we be broader in how we assess people's applications for promotion, applications for a job, and so on and so forth. So I think there's some really significant secondary impacts. So in conclusion, I'm still not sure that complete harmonisation in such a diverse and heterogeneous landscape is actually possible. I'm not completely convinced about it, but it's certainly, even if it is possible, it's not going to be something that's easy to do. But I do think the developing international codes of conduct that attempt to harmonise is still a really, really worthwhile activity, because in terms of primary output, it does bring the national systems a little bit closer together and really helps in enhancing understanding and perhaps finding some solutions, potential solutions together. And also, I think, which is even more important on a national level, there are many, many beneficial secondary impacts from developing these international codes of conduct. So, thank you very much. I probably don't have time for questions.
We have time for questions. Just come to a microphone if you have a question.
Excellent.
Hi, Ginny Barber from COPE. Well, actually not COPE, I was COPE until last week. So thank you for the shout out for the COPE guidelines. That's great to hear them feeding in.
Yeah.
But I just wondered if you had any reflection on how best those diverse organisations can feed into international guidelines. Because we, like you, we sort of feel often we provide input into lots of different ones, and sometimes it's hard to know where to focus your efforts.
Yeah, I know. That's a tricky question, because of course all of these, if you look at the organisations that are developing these guidelines, they're coming at things from very different perspectives as well. I think there are a couple of initiatives which might help. The Inari initiative, which is kind of like a super network, a network of networks that's been started in Europe, is one potential way that you might be able to pull these disparate, as opposed to desperate, and maybe they are desperate, it depends, sort of agendas and perspectives together. But it's very tricky because they are coming at things from different angles. But I suppose, as I said, the European Code of Conduct this time around, we had a really, really wide, broad stakeholder consultation. We had publishers, we had industry, we had academies, we had young researchers, we had LERO and the EUA and other kind of academy or academic focused organisations, all feeding into a single code, which was a really interesting process. It hadn't really been tried like that before, and I think it worked very well. So I think there's room for that kind of approach. Yeah.
Two possibilities. How about using artificial intelligence to actually amalgamate all the codes?
Yeah.
Second possibility, why not keep the codes separate and allow evolution to work on the variances that you've got in order to see which codes emerge as the most preferable codes?
Yeah, I think that's actually what's happening. It has been more evolutionary, because some of the codes have sort of dropped off the radar a little bit more. They were very important at one point, but they've become less so. So I think evolution may take care of some of this.
It's a classic case.
Exactly. Let me just ask a question, and that is, when you feel you need to deviate from whatever the national is, what are the primary factors that seem to make it difficult for you not to harmonize and need localization?
Yeah, I think there's so many different things, because I think we're very lucky in Ireland. We're small. We've had this conversation before, Nick. We're really small, so we can actually get the funders, the researchers, everybody sitting in the academy, the whole lot. We can all sit around one table. We can fit around one table, which is amazing. So for us, it's actually, I think it's not as complicated. We can sort of thrash that one out among ourselves. I think if you're from a big country with a lot of different agendas and you're finding deviations, it's tricky. I don't have an answer for it. I think it is difficult. Yeah.
Good. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Nick.